Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Setting the Middle East further ablaze, with little or even no hard evidence surrounding the alleged use of chemical weapons in Syria, the Obama administration appears determined to enter this conflict with no clear purpose or aim. Obama says the arc of the moral universe may bend towards justice, but it does not bend on its own. Is American intervention in Syria really a bend towards justice? To CrossTalk the war in Syria, I'm joined by Pepe Escobar in Hong Kong. He's an investigative journalist and author. And we also have Stephen Schlesinger in New York. He is a senior fellow at the Century Foundation and author of the book, Act of Creation. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. If I can go to Hong Kong first. Pepe, is this all about justice? Mr. Obama is looking for justice and threatening to bomb Syria.
No, it's about a president of the United States of America enmeshed in his own web because he was reckless enough to declare a red line without thinking about the consequences. And we're not talking about a Palau or some island in the middle of the Pacific. We're talking about the Middle East. So now he's backed into a corner. He doesn't know what to do. He's clueless. My best sources, and Stephen, maybe you can confirm that, in New York and in Wall Street, they tell me he's completely clueless. He's surrounded by a bunch of absolute idiots. Samantha, I got the power in the UN, which, by the way, she was absolutely enraged because the Russian and the Chinese ambassadors walked out of the P5 meeting when they were discussing the British resolution to start a war against Syria. Valerie Jarrett, Susan Rice, absolute mediocrities. He doesn't have a clue. He doesn't know what to do. So now he's trying to wiggle out and find an exit strategy that does not include his humanitarian Tomahawk war. Look, this is tragic comedy. More tragic than comedy.
Okay, Stephen, that was a real mouthful there. And would you agree or disagree with what we heard from Pepe in Hong Kong there?
Well,
Samantha's got the power.
I have to say, I do know that Samantha Power is actually a very intelligent individual, and I think she'll be a classy diplomat at the UN. But I'm a big fan of President Obama's, but I think he's made a grave error in this respect. I agree with Pepe that he should never have promised this so-called red line a year ago. But I will say that, an American president has the right to change his mind. And in the 1 year since he made that vow, a lot of things have changed in the Middle East. The Middle East is in total chaos at this point. Egypt is in a state of collapse. Lebanon is riven by factions. There are huge refugee flows into Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, 400,000 or 500,000 in each case. Iraq is racked by a civil war. So the circumstances in the past year have changed significantly, and I feel that the President of the United States can say, I did say that
okay,
but
Stephen,
ago,
but he's not saying that. That's important here. He's not saying that.
I agree he's not saying that. So therefore, we have to deal with the reality. Now, the reality is that he has suggested that the only way we can deal with the chemical attack, so-called from the Assad regime, is with missile attacks. But he has not suggested maybe that we could strengthen our sanctions on Syria or maybe send more weapons to the rebels. I mean, there are alternatives to a missile attack.
Okay, Pepe. I mean, I heard you say alleged. I said it as well. Would you like to react to what Stephen said? Go ahead.
Look, of course, Stephen is right that there are alternatives. The alternative would let the UN inspectors do their work. I'll give an example. The Russians spent 3 months on the ground, interviewing people, collecting samples to establish an 80-page report that they presented last month at the United Nations. Anybody can go to internet and find Ambassador Vitaly Churkin at the UN explaining to the press what they were doing. So the UN, the UN inspectors nowadays, they had what? 3.5 days. It's absolutely impossible. They haven't talked to anybody. We have this absolutely bogus photo, Reuters or AFP. We have 2 inspectors with 2 vials, Colin Powell style, and you have a guy smoking behind them. This is completely absurd. What kind of UN inspector is that? Go to the net and find the photo now, everybody. It's completely absurd. They need months to do it properly. And we have a window of opportunity because President of the United States has to fly to Sweden next Tuesday. And next Thursday, next week, he has to face the G20, has to face the leaders of Brazil, India, China, where editorials are going all over the place saying this is Iraq 2.0, and not to mention Vlad himself in person. So no wonder our friend Obama is absolutely desperate.
Okay, Stephen, you wanted to jump in there. Go ahead.
I will say one other thing, and I should have mentioned this before. You know, the other thing Obama could do is press for the Geneva meeting, which had been promised between the Russians and the Americans, to talk about a political settlement in Syria. Now, that seems to be postponed at this point, but why not revive it? And why not suddenly focus on that as another alternative?
Stephen, I agree with you, but out of an outrage, I agree with you. It's because the Americans have been pushing this back and further and further. It's their fault this process hasn't worked, not the Russians' fault. The Russians bent over backwards to get this started, and the Americans just showed almost no interest whatsoever. How do you reply to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that I'm not going to let the Russians off the hook. They've been sending weapons to the Assad regime for years, and they have not shown any willingness to cut back on that.
Perfectly legal, too. Perfectly legal to a sovereign state for years and years and years.
These are legal contracts.
Yeah, these are legal contracts.
It's just like America selling $60 billion to...
Go ahead, Stephen. Jump in. Go ahead. Stephen, finish your point.
If they wanted a political settlement, they might at least relinquish that, calm down about the issue of the contract and say, listen, we're going to cut back some of your supplies, Mr. Assad, so we can get a bargain.
It would be kind of hard to do that when the rebels are getting arms. When the rebels are getting arms at the same time. Pepe, jump in.
This is not how the real world works. Sorry, gentlemen. This is how the real world works. Bandar Bush, this is all you need to know. When he became the Director of National Intelligence, appointed by King Abdullah, Bandar Bush not only convinced the Americans to drop Qatar completely. Definition of Bandar Bush, literally. Qatar is 300 people in a TV station. And I think he's exaggerating. I mean, Qatar is actually 5 people in a TV station. And that's it. It's not a country. It's a joke. Saudi Arabia is another story. And Bandar Bush, let's, a quick recap. 22 years ambassador in Washington. He knows every player in the book in the US, in Europe, in the Middle East, and in Asia. He was the go-to guy in the Afghan jihads in the 1980s. He did the Afghan jihad in the 1980s. So this is the real player. And now he's in charge of Syria. So we have to deal with what Bandar wants, which is not what the Obama administration wants, and it's not what Israel wants. We have 3 different agendas converging in Syria. In fact, Bandar and the Israelis are trying to maneuver the Obama administration to fight a war for them.
Okay,
in fact, for their interests.
All right, a lot said there. Let's be fair. Fair time.
Of the United States
Pepe,
to
fair
get a war
time.
in Syria.
Let's go to Stephen. Stephen, jump in. Go ahead.
I mean, one of the many consequences of a missile attack by the U.S. on Syria may be an attack by the Syrians and the Iranians on Israel. I mean, speaking of, unintended consequences.
It's not going to happen.
And frankly, that's something that I don't feel that this administration has really figured out. The other thing I might mention is that a Republican who I don't necessarily ever agree with on most issues, the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, has actually sent a letter to Obama asking him 14 questions about exactly what his strategy is if we bomb Syria. I mean, including the question of what happens if a missile attack occurs and it doesn't change anything. And, Assad continues to do what he wants to do. you're going to then have people in this country demanding, well, if that didn't work, we got to, increase our pressure. We got to put troops in there. We got to do all sorts of other things, which would be absolutely a disaster. It would be another Iraq, another Afghanistan. And on the contrary, if it does work, if the missile attacks do have the impact of
who do they
decreasing
empower?
or at least
who do they empower?
Terminating a lot of the use of any weaponry, then they're going to say, well, hell, if the Syrian regime is tottering at this point, let's complete the attack and wipe it out. So either way, it seems to me the U.S. is dragging itself into a quagmire which it's not going to be able to escape from.
Okay, Pepe, but I don't see the United States is dragging itself anywhere. It's pushing hard.
No. The United States is being dragged. We have to go back to the basics. It's Israel and Bandar Bush that are dragging the U.S. to a war that is completely absurd in terms of U.S. interests, security, national credibility, you name it, in the Middle East and all over the world. The mini coalition of the willing is a bloody joke. It's the Brits, the French, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and the U.S. Do you call this international community? It's a bloody joke. And, and when we talk about the Dumb and Dumber remix of the Sykes-Picot 1917 agreement, now represented by William Hague in London and Laurent Fabius in Paris, it's even worse. It degenerates into self-parody, in fact. It's ridiculous. It's totally ridiculous. Coming back to a very important
point. All right, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We have to go to a short break. We have to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Syria. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the civil war in Syria. Okay, Stephen, if I can go back to you in New York, the United States and the UK say they can attack Syria without a United Nations Security Council mandate. How is that possible? That's beyond international law. They say they can do it under humanitarian grounds. So where do the two meet?
I understand that they've come up with some various rationales for the attack. Humanitarian grounds is one of them. Active defense is another, because under Provision 51 of the UN Charter, states are allowed to defend themselves against attacks. But it's stretching, in both cases, it's stretching these terms in a way that twists them.
Yeah, but I mean, I suppose Syria could invoke that one, couldn't they?
Anybody could invoke those things. And the point is, it's not just the UN is not supporting this. You don't have the Arab League. The Arab League has refused to endorse any kind of military action. NATO, for that purpose, has not issued any statement in support of this. You don't even have in the American polling data. There's very little support among the American citizenry for any attack on Syria. I don't quite understand 9%. How Obama thinks he has really solid grounds for this, outside of the fact that he feels he has to, validate his red line that he. Yeah,
it's this amazing thing. Somebody has to do something. Somebody has to do something. That's what he gets down to. Pepe, go ahead, because Obama's credibility is on the line right now, and he's looking like a complete buffoon, foreign policy-wise.
His credibility is already gone. Come on, look at the NSA scandal. And by the way, have you heard anything about the NSA scandal this past week or so? Of course not. It's in terms of wag the dog to deviate attention. It's perfect. The problem is it's not deviating attention from Obama's shortcomings himself. He doesn't know what to do. He boxed himself in, and he boxed his country's foreign policy in. What kind of a leader of the free world is this? It's ridiculous. And as a a constitutional lawyer. He's trying to find a way out to dribble not only the Congress. Okay, nobody cares about U.S. Congress, so 5% approval rate maybe. Dribble the UN, dribble NATO, dribble international law, and attack unilaterally under the cover of a humanitarian Valerie Jarrett, Samantha, I got the power, R2P scheme. This is ridiculous.
Stephen,
Listen, I think that I think you're being a little unfair. I think the fact is that President Obama has shown restraint for the last couple of years. He has not gone into Syria. This is what troubles me so much. He's been very good in the sense of keeping America out of that minefield. And he's actually, any American president, frankly, who had to deal with the series of crises and upheavals throughout the
but Stephen, all the crises that you mentioned, all of the crises that you mentioned at the beginning of the program,
has kept us out of crises that we
but
could
all
have
of those
gotten
crises,
very easily, much more mired easily before.
Stephen, all of the crises you mentioned are driven or a result of American foreign policy. So we should thank Obama for not using more violence? You mentioned all of them in the beginning of the program.
Listen, I think it's a great tribute that people think that everything in this world is driven by American foreign policy. I wouldn't say that would be true if you look at what happens internally is in Afghanistan and Iraq has proven to be irrelevant to American foreign policy. In fact, it's so irrelevant that the Americans have had to withdraw from both countries because they no longer have any control over what's happening there.
Yeah, they broke both countries.
So I think you exaggerate the impact of American...
No.
Pepe, go ahead.
Wait.
Go ahead.
Let's
go to Pepe.
anymore.
Come on, fair time, Pepe. Jump in.
No. Wait. They didn't, no withdrawal. I know because I've been there in both places extensively. They were defeated by a bunch of Pashtuns, which have been defeating imperialists for, 5 centuries, 10 centuries, or whatever. And they were defeated by a bunch of Tawa heads in Anbar province with IEDs. I know these people, I talked to them, and they won both wars. This is what happened with the American empire. Live with it.
Stephen?
Well, I think that in both cases, it shows the limit of American power. I mean, the fact is that you can blame the U.S. for every crisis that goes on this planet, but when you really look at the factuals on the ground, you see that very little can be accomplished by U.S. military power. The best thing that the Americans can do is diplomatic power. In fact, one of the real unintended consequences of an American missile strike on Syria will be the fact that the U.S. will never be able to start real negotiations with the Iranians, which are a real bugaboo. And under this new Iranian president, who seems fairly moderate and seems to be reaching out to the West, I think we should attempt to start real negotiations. But these could be totally undermined, it seems to me, if we attack Syria.
Okay. Pepe, is it a done deal that an attack will happen?
Can I agree with Stephen, Peter?
Go ahead, please do.
Peter, can I agree with Stephen? Yes.
Oh, I don't really like it, but go ahead.
There's no question.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Pepe.
No, I'm agreeing with his point that diplomacy is the only way out. This is what the Russians have been saying for 2.5 years. And Sergei Lavrov has been saying this every week. The Americans are bombing our negotiations. When Kerry and Lavrov got into an agreement of how to organize Geneva II, which, by the way, has been postponed since June, it's never going to happen, Geneva II. And Bandar Bush himself told Putin, Geneva II is not going to happen because the opposition, they want Assad out now. So the only possibility is the Geneva II roadmap. Everybody together at the same table, including regional players and the big powers outside. Roadmap from that, discussions, including the non-armed Syrian opposition.
I agree with you. I agree with you, Pepe, but no one will give a chair to the Iranians, right?
Exactly. How can you discuss peace in Syria without the Iranians?
Figured into an eventual equation.
Okay, Stephen,
I agree with that.
Go ahead, Stephen. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I think it has to. I think that obviously the Iranians have to be part of any eventual settlement. You know, people forget that even under George W. Bush, the Iranians were involved in setting up the Afghan government in 2001. 2002 because they had an interest in that region.
Yes, yeah, they did.
So we have dealt with the Iranians before in political settlements, and there's no reason we can't do it again in the Syrian settlement.
Well, the last group of sanctions, the last group of sanctions show that. It's ridiculous, this ridiculous policy the U.S. has towards Iran. Okay, Pepe, is Syria really all about Iran? Because that's what a lot of people will say.
No, it's not only about Iran. It is, road to Damascus, first road to Damascus and then a road to Tehran. There's no question. But it's also trying to cut Syria as the sort of middleman or the passage between Iran and Hezbollah. In terms of the Sunni-Shiite conflict, in terms of Bandar Bush's perspective, in fact, if we take over Syria, let's put it this way, like a hardcore Sunni government allied with Saudi Arabia, Iran is isolated from the Arab world, and Hezbollah is isolated as well. From the point of view of Israel, if Syria is out of the picture, and it's one of them in power, one of us in power, in fact, Hezbollah is totally isolated, and then we can try to invade Lebanon again. Just like they did in 2006. I was there afterwards. It was a total disaster. So the agendas, as I said before, they are completely different. The problem is for the Obama administration. What is the big agenda? Try to find a deal with Tehran. This is the most important issue in the Middle East.
I would agree with that.
Because the interest, in the long run, the interest of the U.S. and Iran, they converge.
Okay, but Stephen, it's not going to happen, is it? It's not going to happen. If it does, how could it happen?
It still could happen. It would happen if we, in fact, pull back on our threats against Syria, or at least come up with alternatives to a missile strike. There's no question in my mind that this idea that the only way we can deal with Syria today is to use cruise missiles to take out certain military depots within that country. I just think that one of the reasons why Obama said last night on public television that no decision has been made yet is he's starting to feel the pressure, the fact that he hasn't gotten UN endorsement, that NATO won't back him up, that the Arab League won't endorse what he wants to do. Maybe, I'm just saying this because he claims to not have made the decision yet, he is looking for an alternative. I certainly would hope so, because he still has time to reverse any drastic decision towards these attacks. And why not take advantage of this space? Why not take advantage of the fact that the Republicans in Congress under the majority leader,
but Stephen, if I can go to Pepe, what happens to the red line? Bury it?
Exactly. And now we need a psychological analysis of this whole thing, and also cultural. It's, putting your member on the table and say, my member is bigger than yours. This is what Obama said with the red line, and now he has to prove it. I'm very sorry to say that, but this is how it works. If we look at the Arab world, is more or less the same thing. And in Asia, it's the equivalent of not losing face. So from a Chinese point of view, he simply cannot afford to lose face, because he already said he was going to do it. And now he has to do it. Even if it's 1.5 million cruise missile against, I don't know, a carpet store in the Aleppo Bazaar. But he has to do something. Okay, it's his fault.
Okay, on that point, gentlemen, a very interesting analysis there, Pepe. I want to thank my guests today in Hong Kong and in New York. And I want to thank our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love you.